This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the constitutional era. The virtuous citizenry. The ideal of the new American Republic was one of the virtuous citizen that would place a check on governmental power. This originated with the Roman ideal of a farmer, and the American notion became known as the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer was an individual who was suspicious of centralized government, bankers, and large landowners. They saw the Northeast bankers and business leaders as being people who were centralizing power by centralizing wealth. On the opposite side, the Northeast bankers and business leaders saw the farmers as being uneducated, backwards, and primitive. The Revolutionary Confederation. Right after the American Revolution, the first style of government that the Americans created was known as the Articles of Confederation. This was seen as a true form of government coming out of the Revolutionary Republic. The reason why was because the Revolution had placed its faith in the power of the people. But since this ideal was too idealistic, reality in the end was placed as local to the people as possible. In this case, it was put into the power of the state governments. One vision was to have a unicameral or one-house legislature without any governor. A second vision was to have a bicameral or two-house legislature with checks and balances on the upper and the lower house. Articles of Confederation. Pennsylvania's John Dickinson called for a federal government. The federal government would be a unicameral legislature for some type of centralized government. However, within the system, the states would be favored over this centralized government. Also keep in mind that Thomas Paine's philosophy was behind much of this reform, and he had advocated the destruction of any type of hierarchy, especially that of the monarchy. The Articles of Confederation, their disadvantages. There were several disadvantages to the Articles of Confederation. First, there was a lack of any common currency. Each state had their own currencies, and each one of these currencies had different values. This made trade very inefficient. Second, the federal government, that unicameral house that I talked about in the previous slide, had to have a unanimous vote to pass any amendment. The government lacked any national military, and while taxation could be accepted, taxation was done on a voluntary basis. Finally, the U.S. owed a national war debt and had a lack of faith from any other countries, impairing international trade. The Great Accomplishment. The Confederation Congress did create one major accomplishment, and it was a process for incoming territories to become states. This was known as the Northwestern Ordinance. The Northwestern Ordinance created Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Also, the Congress made sure to get rid of all slavery in these new territories. The ghost of the Constitution. The Constitution was eventually formed largely due to the context surrounding the Articles of Confederation and some of the fears that the Founding Fathers had. Their fears were of people like Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was the leader of a group of farmers who had been forced to pay their mortgages on their farms. The problem was these farmers lacked any money because they had been fighting in the Revolution. The Massachusetts Assembly forced the farmers to pay for their mortgages. So, Daniel Shays led a rebellion of 300 farmers into Boston. Eventually, General William Shepard put down the rebellion, but the consequence was a desire for a stronger centralized government, military, and ordered economic system to solve for future possible rebellions. The Constitutional Convention. The makeup of the Constitutional Convention included mainly lawyers, merchants, bankers, and large landowners. The main opponents to the Constitution were missing, people like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Samuel Adams. The proponents wanted to have a strong centralized government to regulate trade and protect internal security. However, opponents feared that this type of system would eventually grow into a system similar to England's centralized monarchy. Major areas of conflict during the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention led into the following major areas of conflict. Number one, there was a fight between big and small states over how best to represent the population sizes. Small states wanted equal representation for each one of the states, while big states wanted representation based upon the proportion of the population. Number 2, there was a question of whether or not to count slaves as part of the Southern states' representation. Southern states believed that slaves should be counted for representation while not being counted as human beings. This would make sure that Southern states would increase their representation within Congress and protect slavery. Also, it would mean that they would not get taxed as much on property taxes. Northern states, however, ironically, wanted slaves to be human beings, but not to be counted towards representation, and also wanted to tax Southern states for their property of slaves. The real hope here was to limit the growth of slavery. Number 3, the question of how to deal with runaway slaves. And number 4, the fight between the merchant states in the North and the Southern slave-owning states in the South. The Federalist Papers. Once the Constitution was formed and was sent out to states to be ratified, the big question was how to get people on board. So 2 men, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, wrote a pamphlet called the Federalist Papers, which included a number of papers trying to justify the Constitution. The most important that I want you to remember is Federalist Paper number 10. Federalist Paper number 10 established the following principles. First, the idea of federalism, a sharing of power between the centralized government and states. Their argument behind this was that this would make sure that the centralized government would never gain so much power that it would become like the monarchy. Principle number 2. Factions would compete amongst each other for power within the centralized government. In other words, there would be so many groups competing over their self-interest that they would nullify one another and check and balance one another to make sure that no one group ever attained too much power. And principle number 3. Checks and balances between the branches of government would stop any one group from gaining too much power. The Bill of Rights. However, once the Constitution was formed, there was an argument between those who favored the Constitution, people called Federalists, and people who were against the Constitution, these people called Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were led by Thomas Jefferson, and he demanded that there be a specified group of rights to protect states from centralized government. Alexander Hamilton, who led the Federalists, warned against this idea because he believed that if there was a written group of rights, that would limit the citizenry to those rights only, and the federal government could just go around this. Eventually there was a compromise, and the compromise was to list out 10 specific amendments to protect the states. 2 visions of the Republic. Once the Constitution was ratified by the states, there were 2 groups that formed, interpreting the Constitution in 2 separate ways. Alexander Hamilton, who led the Federalists, argued for a strong centralized government that would pay the national debt and create a mercantile trading system. He also believed the country needed a national bank, like the one in England, in order to create a well-regulated economic system. Thomas Jefferson, who led a group of people called the Democratic Republicans, believed that the better way of interpreting the way that the government ought to be run is a government in which there was a federal government, but most of the power would be given to the states, or states' rights, and that would emphasize local control. The ideal for him was the yeoman farmer, who, like we said before, had a distrust of all elites, including government, mercantile, and banking elites. The French Revolution. Once the American Constitution was formed, a major incident occurred across the sea that would test the visions of both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and that was the French Revolution. At first, everyone, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, supported the first phase of the French Revolution, which was a constitutional phase, creating a larger French parliament. However, during the second phase, or the Reign of Terror, you saw the split between the Federalists, who tended to be more elite in society, and the common farmers. Jeffersonian Republicans supported the French, as they believed that this was a revolution of the common farmer like the American Revolution. But the Federalists believed that there was a difference in France, and that what was going on in France was not so much a democratic revolution, but a rise of a mob based upon anarchy. The Whiskey Boys Rebellion. One of the Frenchmen came to gain support from the Americans, named Citizen Edmond Genet. He came to America in order to recruit soldiers for the French Revolution. Genet was exiled from America for overstepping the boundaries of American sovereignty. France expected America to protect its Caribbean possessions and really to support the French Revolution. However, Washington was against this. Eventually, Washington attempted to raise money for an army in order to protect against some of these internal dissenters. One of the biggest examples of this was a rebellion led by the Scots-Irish in the Appalachian Mountains. And this was because when Washington tried to raise money to support an army off of this excise tax, this hurt the Scots-Irish, whose main economy was based upon being able to develop alcohol in the Appalachian Mountains. Washington led a militia to put down the Whiskey Boys and then advocated for some type of national army in order to make sure that these internal rebellions would not happen again.